Welcome everyone. Agenda item 17 under the title of Analysis of the Continuation of Agenda item presented by Dr. Noha about the analysis of the occurrence data of lead in spice mixtures. The background: in 2024, the maximum level was reviewed of the lead in spices, especially spice mixtures. The conclusion: no mLs for spice mixtures. That led to a gap in regard to application of standards and evaluation. In 2024, for CAC 47, they adopted maximum levels for lead in spices, including dried seeds, excluding based on CCF17 proposals. Putting into consideration the maximum level of lead, but for spices mixture, there was no limit or specific limit. There is a EWG as a response to the Codex Committee to support the discussion on setting Codex maximum level for lead in multi-ingredient product. For the committee, presented detailed analysis of lead contamination using data retrieved from GEN database. $14,000 samples were analyzed over 10 years in 2014 and 2024, including more than 5,000 were considered spice mixtures. For this analysis and the finding, they presented that these mixtures, they had amount of lead more than individuals. In regard to individuals and spices and the lead, they had less than spice mixtures. They were interested in their impact on the infants. Next, JAFCA lead exposure assessment for spice mixtures use consumption data from the GEMS cluster diet. They needed to know the spice mixture, how to evaluate it, whether on evaluating the product itself or for the consumption. While GEMS food provided per capita space availability, they offered more details individual intake. However, limitations include the lack of specificity for a spice mixture, limited data for many regions, including Arab countries, and small sample sizes, underscoring the need for better targeted consumption data. There was difference whether to take evaluation dependent on food consumption or do we evaluate the spice mixture as a product. In regard to consumption data for food cluster diet data, the type of data was per capita food availability. For FAO, individual dietary intake data. For Netherlands and other countries, they took reliable individual intake. There was difference in finding. For GEMS database, there was an average of 2.6 grams per kg per person, and FAO less than gram per day consumption. And for other countries, there were comparison between intake of children and intake of adults. There was a difference. They needed to have a unified thing to evaluate these products. JAFCA proposed two potential maximum limits for lead in spice mixtures and evaluated their effectiveness in reducing dietary exposure and their enforcement implications, as summarized below. JAFCA's work provided a scientific foundation for CCCF's discussions on the feasibility and public health benefit for adopting a Codex maximum level. They needed to check, is it feasible to take into consideration the consumption, especially that it differs for adults and children. As part of its assessment, the FAO, the expert committee, JAFCA, evaluated the need for setting Codex maximum levels for lead spice mixtures based on risk assessment framework. They put into consideration exposure assessment for two populations, adults and children. Adults 84 kg, children 20 kg and below. Next. Another method was using the endpoints for risk characterization. JAFCA used health-based guidance values for lead toxicity, especially that affect neurodevelopmental effects in children. They decided certain values, POD, points of departure, 0.6 ppp by weight per day, 1.3 ppp by weight per day, the same. So these endpoints, not all countries are taking the same measures. They don't take into consideration the consumption, intake, and the weight. These variations, it is very difficult to apply this type of calculation and analysis. When JAFCA applied an internationally accepted risk assessment framework combining global occurrence data from GEMS, and it decided that health-based guidance values were 0.6 ppp by weight per day for children and 1.3 ppp kg by weight day for adults. The two maximum limits were 2 ppm and 1 ppm. As much as the ppm increase, the reduction reduce. As one of our colleagues stated earlier, it is very difficult to be applied. We would have to take into consideration the rejection of the samples that impacts trade. The third approach was using risk characterization. If we take into consideration the maximum limits for children as 0.31 and adults 0.08, we can see points of departure will be 52% for children, and for adults will be 6%. As we go down and as we increase maximum limits, and the rejection criteria will decrease. This is important. In trade, greatest public health concern is for children, as you can see from the table. Last but not least, we have certain data from Bahrain. And from this data, we analyze a lot of spice mixtures, including masala, mixed spices, curry powders, Bahrain Ibzar, like the one used for fish and for beef and fish. These are some of the values that we have for spice mixtures. As you can see, the maximum was around 1.8 ppm. The spice mixtures usually have higher lead if we take into consideration these methods. Next. The key objectives was that 59 samples were analyzed. 7 samples exceeded the JAFCA, indicating moderate level of non-compliance. Most masala and mixed spices, including traditional Bahraini masala blends, showed low lead contamination. Higher lead levels and greater variability were observed primarily in certain mixed spice blends and Bahraini bizarre samples, which may reflect complexity in sorting, the variety of raw materials used, and less controlled processing steps taken in factories. Spices like curry powders and other simpler blends show low lead levels, reinforcing the possibility of maintaining safety margins across different spice categories. Next, نحن نتحدث عن جدوى وهذه. Of course, not all Arab laboratories are equipped with the needed instruments to analyze the spices, mix spices, and make comparisons, especially on routine basis. This requires a lot of training, a lot of manpower, and budget. So variability in certain mixed spice types and collected in the country will require detailed studies. And these spices are done in Bahrain, are collected over a past vast period. Not all countries may have this. The recommendation is to have a regional collaboration, especially between countries, depending on standards, trained laboratory capacity, and sharing of information. Especially that some brands are used in more than one country. The conclusion and recommendation methodology applied by JAFCA include available international occurrence data and use of high percentile exposure estimates. However, uncertainties remain, particularly due to limited and non-specific consumption data for spice mixtures. As an example, in Bahrain, we analyzed this spice mixture as we did not take into consideration the consumption for children or for adults to evaluate such product. For GEMS database and sparse regional data from urban other underrepresented countries. The conclusions and recommendation. Mainly, we require unified implementation of whatever standard is used. If it was an example of 2 ppm, or whether it was something based on the consumption level, We have to take that into consideration and unify our evaluation in all Arab countries, depending on the Codex and JAFCA recommendations. Thank you.